Spunky by Dori Brink. This is the third part, beginning at chapter 7. If you missed the first two, go back and look for them. Spunky. Chapter 7. By mid-afternoon of the next day, Daphne had grown tired of chasing after me. She put me back on the newspapers after another sudden rush to the rug and sighed deeply. Slowly, she returned to the dishes she had been washing. Her arms sagged to her sides and she leaned back against the sink. Then her eyes lit up as she looked at me with a sudden thought. "Come with me," she said, and I followed her. She walked to the door with slow, deliberate steps and opened it. "Look, Spunky," she pleaded. "When you want to go outside, say, 'Woof, woof.'" The sound she made was very much like my own. "See," she said, closing and opening the door again. "Outside." I knew what outside was. I pulled one corner of my mouth into a side grimace and looked at her patiently. Would she really take me out if I barked? Could it be as easy as all that? I had my doubts. She closed the door with a final slam and went back to the kitchen. I listened to her washing the dishes for a while. Then I decided to try it. I went to the door, sat down beside it, and barked. Daphne came running over to me. "What's that?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Woof, woof," I repeated clearly. Her mouth opened wide, and she did not seem to know where to move first. She grabbed her jacket and my leash and opened the door, trying to pump her arms into the sleeves at the same time. We ran down the stairs together without stopping once. Daphne was in a very good mood that night. She was full of laughter during dinner and chatted away brightly even when Peter went into the living room and tried to read his newspaper. "He really did," she was saying. "He sat down at the door and barked just the way I told him." "Sure, sure," Peter said, raising his eyebrows to the ceiling the way he had done the last time she told the story. I settled down beside Peter's chair and watched him tap his foot on the floor in time to Daphne's chatting. There were many strange things in Peter's home, but the strangest thing of all I discovered in the bedroom one morning. I wandered into the room, sniffing around the side of the bed where Daphne was sitting. With a laugh, she scooped me into her arms, pressing me against her so that my front paws dangled over her shoulder. Suddenly, on the dresser facing me, I saw a dog. It had long, silky ears and a round, shiny nose. A spray of hair partly covered its eyes, and shaggy, long, curling hair covered the rest of it. Its ears pricked up when it saw me, and a long, flowing tail waved back and forth. I barked. The dog barked. I wiggled out of Daphne's grasp, bounded across the bed and up on the dresser. My nose bumped up against a hard, smooth surface. The dog's face was close to me, but I could not smell a trace of its scent. The tail was waving back and forth quickly. I barked, and it barked. Daphne laughed. "Spunky, that's you," she explained. "Me?" I was bewildered. What did she mean? I sniffed the hard surface again. Then I peeked behind it. The dog was gone. Only when I looked in front of it did I see the dog again. Daphne picked me up. Now Daphne was holding the dog and smiling. "See, Spunky? That's me, and that's you." Now I understood. Daphne could be in two places at one time. "It's a mirror," she said. I learned to accept mirrors wherever I found them. In a pool of water in the street, in shiny lamps, metal doors, just about anywhere. Each time I saw the dog again, I pretended not to notice him. That afternoon, unexpectedly, I got a chance for freedom. "How would you like to go for a walk in the park?" Daphne asked. I looked up at her puzzled. What was a park? She put the leash on me and we went outside. We walked for a long time before reaching a wide fence surrounded by trees. A cobbled pathway led inside. Quiet stretches of grass and tangled bushes lay before us. The farther we walked, the more excited I became. Here were things I knew and understood. birds trilling, leaves rustling, scents of other animals, and earth baking in the sun. I wanted to explore every part of it and tugged frantically. Daphne bent down and took off my leash. I was free! For a moment I was startled. I buried my nose in all the strange new scents, trying to identify them. I retraced each enticing path, getting deeper and deeper into the bushes. I could hear Daphne calling me, but I had no intention of going back to her. I went on and on, zigzagging in and out of every bush I found. There was a clearing in front of me. A bird was sitting on a rippling surface, flapping its wings but not flying away. I moved closer to it, entranced. It seemed to glide farther away. I ran after it. Suddenly, the ground dissolved underneath me. Water poured into my ears and mouth. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I struggled desperately to find solid ground. Then, hands clutched me and swept me into the air. Daphne was carrying me in her arms. She set me down on the cobbled pathway. I shook the water out of my ears and body. Then I heard the leash being clipped onto my collar, and Daphne was pulling me. I held back, trying with all my strength to free myself again. She pulled harder. "Come on," she said harshly. "We're going home." She pulled and managed to drag me out of the park. My freedom was short-lived. On Saturday, without warning, Daphne put me in Peter's car and announced that we were going to see the nice doctor. As soon as we entered the waiting room, the harsh smell of medicine hit my nostrils. I could hear the faint sounds of animals whining with fright somewhere behind the walls. Daphne sat down and picked up a magazine. I ran to the door leading outside. She picked me up and put me in her lap. "Be good," she said. "The nice doctor won't hurt you." I shivered. A woman in a white coat motioned for us to follow her. The doctor was standing behind a high table with a bright light over it. Daphne put me on top of the table, murmuring soothing words to me and stroking my ears. I scrambled to jump off. The doctor firmly held me back. His touch was not unkind. I relaxed a little. His hands probed all over me, my eyes, nose, ears, stomach, and back. He used a wooden stick to look at my tongue and throat. Finally, Daphne asked, "Is he healthy, doctor?" "Oh, yes, she's very healthy." "Oh," said Daphne with an embarrassed laugh. "I always call dogs he." The doctor smiled while concentrating on a long needle he was filling with fluid. "Well, he's a she, all right." The color in Daphne's face deepened. "My husband also calls dogs he without thinking. Just a habit," she added quickly. "Judging from her teeth," said the doctor, frowning at the needle, "I would say she's about 3 months old. This rabies shot is none too soon." I shifted my paws and kept an eye on the doctor's hands. One of them now pointed the needle at me. The other reached for the back of my neck. I yelped. In the needle went. I didn't actually feel pain. Still, I looked at the door longingly. In a moment, my neck was released. Daphne lifted me off the table and put me on the floor. I scrambled to the door and sat down, barking impatiently. They were smiling at me. "Spunky is quite a combination," said the doctor. "Part sheepdog, part terrier, and perhaps a little Hungarian pulley in her." "She's one of a kind," Daphne replied proudly. The doctor bent down and stroked my head. "Smart as a whip," he said. Sitting in the front seat with Daphne, I watched the streets pass as we drove home. A light changed color at a corner, and we waited for it to change again. She leaned toward me, her face tilted to one side. "Give me a kiss?" she asked. I stared straight ahead. She repeated her request, this time pleading. I grumbled my impatience and shifted my front paws without turning my head. I stared at the streetlight. The last thing I felt like doing was kissing her, especially after that visit with the doctor. How could I ever escape all the things she made me suffer? The light changed, and she continued driving. Out of the corner of my eyes, I could tell She was unhappy by the way she pressed her lips together. Chapter 8. I felt a certain tension in the conversation at dinner that night. I listened attentively, an uneasy feeling coming over me. Dodger will make a terrific watchdog, Peter was saying. We'll need one in that place. It's pretty isolated. Right now, anyway. Do you think a dog that's 5 years old can adjust easily? I mean, do you think he'll take to us after living with other people for so long? And by the way, Peter, is Dodger male or female? Daphne said all this very quickly. Peter smiled. Like the nice doctor said, he's a she. Very funny, Daphne replied without smiling, and tapped her nails on the table. Peter continued talking seriously. Dodger's living in a kennel now. That's hard on a big Weimaraner. They're natural hunters, you know. Need lots of space. The people who had her before kept her in a small backyard. Hardly saw the dog during the day. Working people. So Dodger was alone a lot. Why did they have to give her up? Moved to an apartment, and you can't keep a dog like that in an apartment. A worried pause. Can't we wait until we move to the house before picking her up, Peter? I want to take her before the woman who runs the kennel changes her mind. She doesn't want Dodger to suffer being in a kennel a moment longer than necessary. If we don't take the dog right now, she might find someone else. Dodger's a high-strung animal, and prolonged stress might make her sick. Daphne bit her thumbnail. Sounds like she's not used to animals or people. Don't worry, she's a very intelligent dog. She'll be all right. Another worried pause. When do you want to pick her up? Daphne asked. Sunday morning. The woman wants to look you over first. I've already passed inspection with flying colors. Ha! Daphne made a fist and jabbed at him lightly. Peter smiled and took her hand. I could tell he liked her. I wondered why. All the way to the kennel, I had a feeling of apprehension. There was that same current of tension in their talk. What will we do if Mrs. Baxter sees Dodger? Daphne suddenly asked. She didn't make too much fuss over Spunky, but if she sees Dodger, she'll have a fit. Don't worry. We'll be moving in less than a week. I can take Dodger to the job during the day, and at night she can sleep in the car. Daphne was tugging at her fingers. How do you think she and Spunk will get along? I raised my head. I had been resting it in Peter's lap. It was the first time they'd given me a serious thought during the whole drive. We'll see. It wasn't much of a thought. I put my head back in Peter's lap. All this tension was making me tired. The car stopped in front of a low, sprawling building, enclosed by a high metal fence. As soon as the car door clicked open, a herd of dogs crammed against the fence, snarling and barking at us. Peter and Daphne got out and told me to stay. As they walked into the building, the snarls and barks became an uproar, and I was glad the metal fence held all those dogs back. When Peter and Daphne came out again, they were accompanied by a short, tangle-haired woman. At the end of a leash, tightly clasped to her side, was a huge, wild-eyed dog. As they walked to the car, the dogs behind the fence began to whine. The woman turned and spoke to them in a soothing voice. Be good now, Clancy. Susan, stop that noise. Be a little sweetheart now, David. What a love you are. She ran her hand along the metal fence, and some of the dogs managed to lick her fingers through the openings. Still clutching Dodger to her side, she approached the car. I pressed my nose against the window and watched intently. The big dog was trembling with fear. Her eyes darted about, first looking at the woman, then at Peter and Daphne. Her mouth was half-parted, exposing enormous teeth. For a few moments, there was an uneasy silence. Then Daphne stepped forward. I'll take her, she said. She leaned close to Dodger and lightly stroked her ear. The wildness in Dodger's eyes disappeared, and a look of pleading came into them. She searched Daphne's face for kindness. Holding the leash firmly, Daphne led Dodger into the car. With an awkward stiffness, she climbed onto the back seat. She seemed to fill all the space behind me. Daphne sat beside her, stroking her neck and murmuring soothing words into her ear. Peter got in beside me and started the motor. "Don't forget," the woman called as we drove away, "only raw meat." Dodger sat stiffly beside Daphne, eyes darting out of the window, drool oozing out of the corners of her mouth. I settled down to enjoy the ride, now that I had Peter all to myself in the front seat. Peter parked the car about half a block from our building. When he got out, I jumped out after him. Daphne opened the back door and stepped out of the car hesitantly. Dodger sat upright, rigid with fear. Daphne ducked her head inside and patted Dodger on the shoulder. "You stay here," she said. Her voice was soothing. She closed the door, sealing Dodger in securely. We started to walk, then stopped short. A howling from the car was piercing the street like a siren. "We'll have to take her with us," Peter said quickly. He hurried back to the car and opened the back door. Dodger came bounding out. We all rushed up the stairs together, bumping into each other. "Nobody saw us," Daphne whispered to Peter at the landing. Inside the apartment, the air seemed charged with electric currents. Dodger made everything seem small. She prowled around the room, stiff-legged, sniffing everywhere. Peter sat down in his armchair in the living room and watched her. I seated myself on the floor beside Peter and watched too. Daphne went into the kitchen, and the dishes seemed to clatter more loudly than normal. At last, we were called in to eat. There, beside my bowl on the floor, was a giant one, filled with ground raw meat. My bowl had its usual nuggets, topped with strips of chicken and gravy. My appetite was good, but out of the corner of my eye, I watched Dodger. Slowly, the mound of meat was disappearing. Her eyes were narrowed with pleasure. She finished before I did and moved away. Immediately, I left my food to inspect her bowl. A few traces of meat clung to the sides of the dish, and I licked them up. Dodger was watching me. Did she mind? I paused to look at her, a little frightened at the thought of her disapproval. No, she lowered her gaze. It was all right. Now she was inspecting my dish. I felt a moment's panic, but she snorted and turned away from the food. I rushed over to finish my meal before she could change her mind. Peter and Daphne took their coffee into the living room, and I quickly followed them. So did Dodger. When Peter sat down in his armchair, I jumped into his lap. This way, I was higher than Dodger. When she sat down next to Peter's chair, I stretched my neck as high as I could. I was at least a head above her. Peter stroked her gently, but the restless eyes kept darting around the room. I wanted Peter to stroke me too. I nudged his free hand, but he was totally absorbed in Dodger and didn't respond. I nudged again. No response. I nipped his hand. Instantly, Dodger had my ear between her teeth. I yelped. She'd only pressed my ear slightly, and all I had felt was a sting of pain, but I realized she could have bitten my ear off. Dodger was looking directly at me now. Her eyes were angry. I whimpered my hurt at her. All I had done was nip Peter's hand. But suddenly I knew this was exactly what Dodger was forbidding me to do again. I sank down into Peter's lap and lowered my head. What a spot to be in. Didn't I have enough trouble with Daphne? Now I had Big Dodger telling me what not to do. Peter left for work early next morning and took Dodger with him. I'll sneak her back into the apartment tonight when it's dark, he told Daphne before he left. I wanted to go with Peter too, but Daphne held me back from the door. I watched Dodger's short tail twitch nervously as she bobbled down the stairs with Peter, but I envied her just the same. Daphne closed the door behind them, and once again, I was at her command. Something new was added to her attempts to get me to obey her sit-and-stay orders. With each command, she held a bone-shaped biscuit in her hand and only gave it to me after I did as she said. It was a delicious, satisfying thing to chew, and I relished it. This time, she sat down in a low chair and dangled one of those biscuits above her lap. "Come on, Spunk," she said, patting her lap with her free hand. Up! I didn't want to sit in her lap. I sprawled flat on my belly, weighing my desire for the biscuit and my determination to resist her closeness. She lowered the biscuit, and I tried to grab it, but she pulled it away and patted her lap again. Come on, Spunk, up. Okay, she won. I jumped into her lap and grabbed the biscuit out of her hand, but I only stayed for as long as it took me to eat it. Then I scrambled out of her arms and jumped down. In the evening, when Peter came home with Dodger, I noticed a difference in her. She strutted around the apartment with a pleased smile on her face. She followed Peter's every step. How do you like that? Now she had attached herself to my Peter. When Daphne filled our bowls, I watched Dodger eat the huge mound of meat. Elegant. Everything she did was elegant. The way she ate, the way she lifted her head between bites to look at Daphne with appreciation, the way she lowered herself to the floor, even the way she licked her forelegs to clean them after the meal. The only thing I ever licked clean was my whiskers to get at the tasty tidbits that clung to them. When I finished my meal, I went over to Dodger's bowl to inspect it. There was a chunk of meat in the bottom. I scooped it into my mouth. Ha! She had missed that. I looked at Dodger to see if she had noticed. She was smiling at me with utter sweetness. I was confused. Had she left the chunk of meat for me on purpose? I stared back at her for a long, thoughtful moment. Maybe she wasn't so bad after all.